There is once more hope for peace in Ukraine, and it is, once more, freaking out the Europeans. The US and Russia are nearing a proposal for cessation of hostilities along a so-called 28-point peace plan. Here to discuss this with me is Dr. Nicolai Petro, professor for political science at the University of Rhode Island and the author of The Tragedy of Ukraine. Nicolai, welcome back.
Thank you, Pascal. Nice to be with you again.
No, thank you very much for making time on the weekend, because I just needed an expert like you in order to go and dig down how it is that we are now nearing the prospect for proper peace. And I think it is this time prospect, because it seems that on all sides the pressure is increasing toward that end. Can you maybe walk us through what happened last week and how it is that now it seems that Mr. Zelensky is really in a corner that it's difficult to get out of?
Well, there's a combination of notable Russian military successes on the battlefield, and not just in one location or two, but along the entire front line. And that is due to the overwhelming Russian forces that they are able to replenish, both the personnel and the weaponry at a rate that Ukraine is no longer able to do. And that's one aspect that certainly military analysts have been pointing to for a while. And then the second component, the second punch, if you will, to Zelensky's regime is, of course, the corruption scandal, which is not at all finished. In other words, it's just perhaps at the beginning, because we have some 1,500 hours of tapes that are slowly being leaked. And they are, why would they be leaked slowly? Well, there's a lot of speculation in Kiev about why. And the most popular theories are that the Americans, who are known to be the funders and supporters, both institutionally and financially, of the Ukrainian anti-corruption organizations, that they are pulling the strings now. And they are saying, we know what you have on Zelensky's entourage. And so in order to put him in a position where he can no longer deny our requests, lest he lose political legitimacy at home, you can begin to leak these tapes and begin the process of possibly calling into question the legitimacy of his entourage. And if necessary, it will go even further to implicate Zelensky himself. What we know so far from those tapes is that somewhere around, ostensibly, this is, of course, the accusation, not proven in court yet. The accusation is that several ministers in the government are implicated on tapes as having taken bribes through a close associate of Zelensky's, known as Timur Mindic, known to the Ukrainian media as Zelensky's wallet. That this person, on tape, we have him and several individuals that sound like Ukrainian government ministers arranging for kickbacks in the area of energy kickbacks for getting government contracts. And as is well known, those energy resources are not even functioning presently because of Russian attacks. And so the question is, why? In other words, why are they not being defended? Why are they still taking money for services they're not providing? And all these things. But what the these anti-corruption organizations have also publicly stated is that they are not releasing the tapes with respect that affect directly military procurement, because they fear that the results would undermine morale at the front lines. So they are holding on to those. But many people, including the former state prosecutor of Ukraine, Igor Lutsenko, under Poroshenko, expects, as many analysts expect, that is where the largest amount of corruption lies, that it will be not a mere couple of 100 million, but actually an amount that nears billions of dollars, specifically the billions of dollars that the EU and previously the United States has given or granted to Ukraine, either in the form of loans or funding, was probably in it seems the implication is in these by these anti-corruption organizations that the people closest to Zelensky are involved. How close? To date, it has been leaked to the Ukrainian media that the figure who is the chief of staff, Andrei Yermak, the person who will be leading the Ukrainian delegation to the peace talks negotiated in Switzerland, to be negotiated in Switzerland this week, is the head of that delegation, and he and Zelensky relies on him very much. So even though he is identified on the tapes with the code name, and I apologize, this is very funny, but it's not really. His code name is Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. His code name, Yermak's code name, is Ali Baba. And but all of this has yet to be proved in court, but it looks very bad. And according to, again, leaked reports of surveys done by the presidential administration, Zelensky's popularity rating has fallen 40% since this scandal erupted. So that's what is putting pressure on him, on the current regime, on the current administration, to negotiate a peace deal. What peace deal? Which one? Well, there's only one, because the Europeans have not offered a single proposal. They have not, in the last 4 years, come up with a single peace plan of their own. They have simply said, we support Ukraine, and they have to make a decision, but if it were up to us, we would continue fighting. Merz, this week in South Africa, I just saw him on German television, said it is up to Ukraine to make the decision, and up to the Europeans as well to decide whether or not to end this war. So that's a little bit confusing, because I thought that the idea was for the Ukrainians to make peace and for the Europeans to support them in whatever decision they made, but that's not actually what Merz said. He actually said that he wishes to be the one, the Europeans, deciding as well whether any peace formula is acceptable. And by virtue of proliferating the number of actors, Ukraine, the Ukrainian leadership, and the Europeans have in the past effectively stymied any negotiations by simply insisting that there should not be peace. There should instead be a ceasefire. Well, a ceasefire and a peace treaty are antithetical to one another, because a peace is actually decided, is actually designed to end a conflict once and for all, to come to a conclusive agreement about all the matters of disagreement. A ceasefire is designed merely as a cessation of hostilities, with the possibility always open that hostilities could then be renewed. Why would they be renewed? Because it would give an opportunity to the party that is at a disadvantage entering into the negotiations to redress that disadvantage and then to resume the fight to its advantage. So that has always been an openly stated secret among Ukrainian military leaders, among Ukrainian nationalists, and under previous administrations, it has actually subsequently been stated as the Ukrainian position during the actual Minsk negotiations, which is why the Minsk negotiations never reached any conclusion, because they were never intended to reach a conclusion. They were intended merely to preserve the status quo while Ukraine built up its army, which it did very effectively, as we now see. So, in order to get around that, Russia has insisted on the end goal, on having a peace treaty, and for close to 4 years now, stipulated what its objectives in that peace treaty are. And this seems to be the first effort, namely Trump's 28-point peace plan, to actually come up with a plan that would be based on what Russia has said are its demands for peace, and then adjust those with the advice and input of specifically Ukrainians, and secondarily, if necessary, the Europeans as well. But I think there seems to be, as far as we can tell, a clearer understanding at this phase that a workable plan will be a plan that is proposed by Russia, that is flexible enough to take Ukrainian and European security concerns into account, and that within that framework, if the United States supports it, we might actually get a peace deal.
Well, thank you very much. That's a very, very good overview. The thing is, this on the one hand, the Europeans are now again very angry at this prospect of a peace deal, which is not. And I must say, their proposal for the last 4 years, 3.5 years, was Russia withdrawing from everything, including Crimea, paying hundreds of billions of dollars in reparations, and Vladimir Putin in The Hague. That was their proposal. And they've been repeating that that's what the end that they want to see, which is basically the complete and utter defeat of Russia, right? On the other hand, we also see that on the battlefield now, Russia has over the last couple of months had, well, it was just moving forward, and one Ukrainian city after another fell. We also had the saga with Mr. Putin meeting Mr. Trump in Alaska, and then there was talks about this meeting in Hungary, which never happened, and it seemed as if though the fronts were hardening again. But now we found out that there always were back channel negotiations, and what is now on the table and what has leaked is a quite well, the basis of it is what people, especially Alexander Mercouris and so on the Iran, they call Istanbul Plus. The 4 regions go to Russia, more or less, the Crimea, of course, and the then you have a framework actually for also reparation payment, also again relations with the United States, and as you said, Europe. So because to Russia, it was never just about the front line. It was never about just territory. It's about a comprehensive security arrangement. Can you maybe talk us through that?
So if we look at the text of the 28 points. I will highlight the ones that seem to me to be worth reiterating because they provide something concrete. In other words, point one, Ukraine's sovereignty will be confirmed.
Sorry,
It's never an issue.
before we do that, can you just tell me your assessment of how credible is this 28-point peace plan, the version that was leaked to the New York Times? Do you believe that this is probably what they are actually working with in Washington and Moscow?
There are a few differences among the versions that are out. This was true, by the way, of the Istanbul Accords as well. I think that when Trump and others say that this is a work in progress, that's exactly what it is.
Okay.
So the differences between the versions are not that important, because what is important in the context of a document that is still evolving is the principle. What is the perspective being taken? And the perspective being taken emphasizes both several things. One is security, one is reparations, and one is human rights, put it that way. So those are the baskets. The security stipulation meets Russia's essential demand, which is that there should be a security framework concluded between Russia, Ukraine, and Europe. So all the parties need to appreciate each other's security interests. Concretely, Russia says that requires stopping the expansion of NATO and not allowing Ukraine to be a member of NATO. However, in exchange, Ukraine should be able to guarantee its own security, which is a formula that Zelensky has used before, because several months ago, President Zelensky said, we understand that NATO is being taken off the table. So what we want, in effect, to replace that is a view of NATO in Ukraine. So as if Ukraine were part of NATO, had the ability to build up its forces to that sort of capacity. And again, what that means is subject to debate. So Russia, or let's say that, I wouldn't call this, it's an exaggeration to say this is Russia's proposal. This is America's proposal, taking into account Russia's concerns and the concerns of others who were involved in commenting on it. And we know from leaks in the Berliner Zeitung that this includes top-level officials from a variety of European countries, that this includes Rustam Umerov, who was the former Minister of Defense and is currently the head of the National Security and Defense Committee, and therefore the top coordinator of military and security policy for Ukraine. He was involved in commenting, and he was given, according to the Berliner Zeitung, the authority to comment and make revisions on it. So it's actually not correct to say that Ukraine was not involved in reviewing this proposal. From what we can tell, although there were high-level officials from Russia involved, most notably Kirill Dmitriev, who met perhaps over the course of 3 days with Steve Witkoff, and perhaps it appears likely also with Umerov at the same time, while the three of them were in Miami. to go over this not long ago, the end of October, that although this plan was hashed out at the time, Putin himself, according to press reports, did not receive it until early November, at which point he spent several hours reviewing it with his experts, and just recently basically signaled, I should say that the reports indicate that he signaled his acceptance in broad terms. And subsequently, the last statement that we have from him yesterday or the day before is that he agrees that while this is not the final product and the details they need to be fleshed out, he agrees with that the basic terms of this agreement could form the basis of a final peace treaty. So those are all optimistic assessments of what is in the treaty, or in the proposal, I should say, that will presumably become a treaty. So the first is the security, a general and comprehensive agreement, non-expansion of NATO. Ukraine will receive security guarantees. These security guarantees will be provided, and this is new, by the United States, perhaps by others as well, but the United States is obliging itself in this document to provide certain security guarantees with 4 conditions. This being Trump, he will, of course, be paid for it. Secondarily, if either side invades, the guarantees are off. If Ukraine invades, if Russia invades, their sanctions will be reintroduced on Russia, and territorial recognition that is proposed elsewhere of occupied territories will be revoked. Interestingly, point 10D, if Ukraine unintentionally fires a missile at Moscow or St. Petersburg, U.S. security guarantees become invalid. Well, okay, that's what's written. That's what's being proposed right now.
Sorry, can you just repeat? If Ukraine unintentionally fires
a missile at Moscow or St. Petersburg, the guarantees become U.S. security guarantees become invalid.
What if it fires intentionally?
Even worse, I suppose. I think the term unintentionally is because, you can always say, well, oops, I'm sorry, I didn't mean, that wasn't us.
Okay. Let's leave that there. Fine.
And Ukraine explicitly may apply for EU membership, and this has always been, I think, stated as being acceptable to Russia, and so that now becomes a matter of public record. So secondarily, reconstruction. And again, following the Trump logic of extortionist tariffs, the United States stands to make a great deal of money off of the frozen assets. In other words, as is currently being proposed, 100 billion of, let's say, 280 billion in Europe specifically, will be invested in U.S.-led reconstruction projects in Ukraine, of which U.S. will receive 50% of the profits. Again, not that different maybe from the way the U.S. has offered military assistance to Ukraine. Very little money actually went to Ukraine. It went to U.S. defense contractors who used it to resupply American stock with newer weapons and ship off the older used weapons over to Ukraine. So from America's perspective, everybody wins. Only some of us win a little bit more. Europe will add on its own another 100 billion. Who knows what percentage of profit they'll get. European assets frozen in Russia will be unfrozen. People often forget that the value of European assets frozen in Russia is not much less than the assets frozen, Russian assets frozen in Europe. So that's something that is something granted to the Europeans. Finally, the remainder, maybe 80 billion or so, of Russian assets will be invested in a special US-Russia investment instrument for joint projects between the two nations aimed at strengthening mutual interest and long-term stability, whatever that is. But I suspect it would be commercial projects between the two countries, since sanctions that the United States imposed on Russia would presumably be lifted. So there we have, and there's some technical details. The Zaporozhye nuclear power plant will be run by the International Atomic Energy Association, but the electricity output will be equally divided between Russia and Ukraine. That's one of Europe's largest nuclear power plant, as I understand it. Oh, and speaking of denazification, which is something that is important to Russia, both countries will implement educational programs fostering cultural tolerance, understanding, and elimination of racism and prejudice. Ukraine will adopt EU standards on religious tolerance and minority protection, which, by the way, they already have. The problem is not that they've adopted, but they are having a difficult time implementing them. Point B, 20B, both sides lift discriminatory measures and guarantee equal access for Ukrainian and Russian media and education. Well, this would be the first time since 1991 that has been the case. And I find that that might, for nationalists, be the hardest thing to swallow in this agreement. And lastly, Nazi ideology and activity will be banned in both countries. Well, of course, Ukraine, as it consistently explains, has already eliminated and prohibited both Nazi and communist symbolism. And if you see anything that resembles a Wolfshaken or any sort of Nazi symbols of World War II, you are not understanding how they are currently interpreted. They are now seen as patriotic symbols, not Nazi symbols. So again, this would be very difficult to implement, or to have to see how especially Ukraine could implement this in good faith in a manner that would be acceptable to Russia. But I suppose it depends on the members of the supervisory committee and what instruments they have to impose the respect for these aspects of the agreement.
Right.
If this agreement follows the pattern of previous agreements, once the fighting stops, the fine point will be tacitly ignored.
Yeah, I mean the important thing on the Russian side is, of course, basically that the four oblasts and Crimea are recognized as part of Russia, that there is a demilitarized zone in the parts that Russia does not occupy yet. So basically the territorial question in that sense to the Russians would be resolved, which is a huge part, especially if everybody puts their signature on there, which then gives it force of international law, which
Yes.
makes it a fact, right? And in return for that, Russia is asked basically to give up money and well,
and agree to the non-use of force.
yeah.
and legislatively indicate that it has, affirm that it has no territorial ambitions in Ukraine or Europe.
Yeah.
So the problem with that, however, has been that the current EU leadership doesn't believe, has said that it would not believe such statements by Russia. Therefore, there is, I suppose, logically no treaty and no proposal that Russia could ever offer that would be acceptable to the EU, because they are assuming that Russia would not abide by whatever it stipulated, even if it were passed in legislation. So it puts the EU in a pro-war stance or an anti-peace stance.
Yeah, but that's I mean that's the current default of Europe anyhow. The point is that if the United States is behind this plan and actually says no, we want this, then you don't leave much room open. I mean, the Europeans are currently again like they're fuming, they're angry, and it's like security of Europe and without Ukraine, it's impossible. But you have no cards. I mean, you have nothing that you can do. And I think Donald Trump said so several times.
Yeah, but let's apply that to Europe. Europe has a high budget deficit to GDP ratio, but economists, optimistic economists, point out that many countries run budget deficits well over 100%. The United States now is 125%. Japan is 200 and something percent.
Yeah.
And life goes on, because the process of printing money and using it, as long as it's all regulated and supervised, the important thing is not how much the debt is, but that it keeps circulating. And as long as it keeps circulating and doesn't stop so that someone is left holding the bag, everyone can sort of participate in this game.
Yeah.
So the argument could be made that Europe still has the ability to significantly raise the debt burden on its own citizens and on its own institutions. It could do that. But the question would have to be asked by European elites at some point, and these elites would then have to be able to translate this into political action. Why? What does Europe gain from pursuing a strategic victory that, on the basic military level and looking at Ukraine's prospects down the road in terms of its population having shrunk by half and its financial insolvency, perhaps as soon as next year, what could Europe achieve out of this except a delay of the inevitable? And here Putin comes back and makes the simple argument. He says, Russia keeps coming up with proposals to end the war now that you don't like. But if you don't like these proposals, the next one will be worse for you, because we will have advanced further and Ukraine will have lost more territory and more population, and you, Europeans, will be in no more of a position to assist Ukraine than you were before. In fact, your own domestic opposition will likely grow. So, as Anatol Lieven put it, I think in his latest piece in Responsible Statecraft, why sign this treaty? Because it's the best option that there is for Ukraine. Instead of looking at the glass half empty and saying, look at all Ukraine has lost, he argues, and I think there's a good deal of logic to this, that retaining 75% of the country independent and supported militarily and financially and politically by the EU is pretty much the best thing that Ukraine can achieve and should be regarded as a victory.
Yeah, and we just need to make it clear. I mean, the Russians at this point really can say, like, look, had you taken Istanbul 2022, that would have been much better than now. If you take it now, that will be better than in a year from now when Russia will be in Odessa. And
Exactly.
I mean, in a sense, I mean, it's not a hypothetical, right? I mean, it has already been proven that this is basically the military logic, and we are back to Clausewitz, where war is the extension of politics by other means. And now the question is, can we get back to pure politics, or do we need to keep this dual approach going on?
Well, it's the same situation with sanctions. In other words, the argument that sanctions have an effect and will lead to a change in policy, or that the EU expectations of a Russian collapse will someday come about, are based on something that they say is likely to happen on the current trajectory. But they do not explain the inconsistencies of that trajectory. The trajectory seems to point in the opposite direction, objectively speaking. And I don't know very many people, even who support sanctions or the current EU policy, that would say things are going well for Ukraine. But they say that although things are going badly, that will change at, let's say, 6 months from now or 8 months from now, but they never actually stipulate when. You could take such an argument as a basis for a legitimate discussion only if the party arguing it explains what the time frame is and what exactly is going to change the equation. Because right now, the equation is very clear. It makes, as you say, Russian victory inevitable. And that victory is going to be even more devastating in the future because that trajectory points in that direction. If you argue that the trajectory is headed in a different direction, explain what the source of that will be, and when we can expect that result to take place. Because without that, it is simply wishful thinking, and that wishful thinking can be indulged in by the European leaders because all they're spending is money, whereas Ukrainians are dying.
So we are at the point in Europe, or what we're seeing from Europe, this a mix of like having having had too much hopium and the German like Durchhalteparolen, like keep on it, just keep going. It will get better, in the bunker while the bombs are falling, but keep going. But this raises the question, like, why is it that the United States is now at this point? I mean, is it the United States that's realizing that this in essence proxy war or coalition war, the project has failed? It has failed, and now we need to get out and get as much as we can. And I thought for a long time the United States at some point would take that position, because it really, I mean, if you look at it, there's no stakes in it. The best that could have come out of this from the US perspective and from a neocon perspective is, of course, the collapse of Russia and the balkanization of Russia. That didn't happen. The opposite happened. Then the second best option would have been basically the US and NATO being able to assert itself and rescue Ukraine, right, and put Russia in its place. That didn't happen. And so the next best thing at some point must be to just take out what you can and leave it.
Yes. What has changed in the United States is the decline of the influence of neocons. Before that, we had liberal internationalists, but neocons are liberal internationalists of a different sort. But they have the same global agenda, which they think the United States can impose. And I guess, I mean, I don't think these people are the current people in the current administration are necessarily deep international relations theorists, but they are simply more comfortable with political realism, which means that they need to see the benefits of global involvement for the United States. And where they see it, they are happy to pursue it. But they see it when we talk about, I mocked a little bit the fact that Trump puts dollar signs on all his policies. But that's better than having a blank check. It's better intellectually and more honest than saying we'll be with you whatever the cost and to whatever objective, because that's a lie. That no country and no political statesman, no statesman ever actually intends to not to pursue a policy without regard to its costs. Yeah. They don't share what they think those costs would be, and they generally underestimate the costs, which leads to problems in the long run. But it is actually very sobering and refreshing for a political leader to say, if we undertake this policy, this is what it will take. And I want to know that that money is going to be reimbursed, that we don't have to go to the taxpayers and disbalance our own economic and political system in order to achieve objectives which are uncertain in the long run. But as long as we can see what the benefit is and make those commensurate with the costs, this could be a good policy. And it's that kind of thinking by people like J.D. Vance, Tulsi Gabbard, Steve Witkoff, who is, after all, only an advisor, but is nevertheless in the mix, that has led to a more realistic policy assessment. I came across the last Putin statement in which he said this could be the basis for a peace settlement. He also said he addressed the question directly in that interview. Why do the Europeans not come to the table? Why don't they even want to discuss with us a possible settlement? And the first thing he came up with, he casually mentioned perhaps lacking mental capacity, but said he didn't want to go into that. But he then said, we also believe that they are simply being misinformed about the conditions on the battlefield. They're essentially, the political leadership is being lied to by the military and intelligence leadership, or the military and intelligence leaders are informing them, but the political leadership is rejecting those conclusions. Either way, there's a disconnect between intelligence, information, military information, and politics within the EU. And that's there's a logic. It makes sense that this would be the case because you see much more cautious statements at the national level by political leaders who have been informed by their own military commanders. But the EU has no military infrastructure. And as a result, we have a complete disconnect between the statements of someone like Ursula von der Leyen or Kaja Kallas, who has no background and no information directly on what is happening at the front, even though Ursula von der Leyen was herself Minister of Defense in Germany for a while, but at a very different period.
Yeah, and on the EU level, probably the issue that some of these leadership some of these elites start believing their own propaganda. So you create yourself a fantasy world that within which you still have the hopium that works, right? And so
Well, I was struck by listening to a year and a half ago, David Cameron,
Mhm.
who former British Prime Minister, and then I think briefly also Foreign Secretary again. And he said, he just stated it as a fact that there is no way that Europe can lose in a confrontation with Russia, because look at the size of our economy, look at the size of the Russian economy, look at the size of how much we spend on the armed forces, not how large our armed forces, how effective they are, but look how much we spend on it, and look how much they spend on it. And that's all you need to know to understand that our victory is inevitable. Well, that's the kind of nonsensical, I would say, abstracted from any reality on the ground that would put these theories to the test. That, I think you're right, political elites in Europe are dreaming about. And by the way, the same thing in the United States. We have a group of American congressmen and senators who issued a statement or a letter saying this was a bad deal. We must support Ukraine. But that's all it amounts to. It amounts to an empty statement that we should do more, but with no clear objective in mind to be achieved by this doing more. And as a result, it's not a policy. It is simply, as Vice President J.D. Vance said, it is a fantasy.
Yeah, yeah. So, in a sense, we're coming to the point where these realities, battleground realities, and political realities are asserting themselves, and we're now at a point where they actually break through. The question to me is, if the goal on the Russian side is now to not only achieve, an end to the fighting in Ukraine, but an actual proper peace agreement that lays the foundation for a security structure, because they've really made it clear that's what they're after. It means that they still need a certain level of buy-in from the Europeans.
Yes.
Even if on the grand scheme the Americans force and twist their arms just as they're twisting the Ukrainian arms, you need at a certain level a little bit of buy-in in order to then start building on that, because otherwise it's not a Pyrrhic victory, but it's an empty victory, right? So how do you think they're trying to achieve that?
I think the situation will be very similar to the situation with sanctions. International sanctions against countries work poorly, and I would go so far as to say, never reliably achieve a change in policy of the country being targeted. Nevertheless, sanctions are more effective the larger the group of nations are that abide by them, and the weight, depending on the weight that those nations carry. The United States is the largest international financial actor. It doesn't, it becomes irrelevant what sanctions Europeans retain if the United States refuses to implement them. It becomes literally an exercise in shooting your own foot by the Europeans to maintain sanctions that the United States is not implement. Their producers and their consumers become the only ones who suffer then as a result, if other international markets are then open to whatever the country is sanctioned, in this case, Russia. So the same outcome, I think, is likely in the case of a security arrangement. If Russia and America reach, or agree, I would say, on a global framework of peace between the two nations, that would by definition enfold Europe within it, it becomes very difficult for Europeans to object to peace.
Yeah.
Now, they still have the ability, if they want, to argue, yes, that's fine. We love peace and we're for peace, but si vis pacem para bellum. So we will continue to build up our domestic defenses, etc., which is essentially a jobs program for a job stimulus program, an industrial stimulus program for many European countries. The United States has no objections to that. Let NATO sort of grow as long as it doesn't expand its commitments. It basically is working to improve its defense capacity. Um, it will be hindered in what it can initiate. NATO will be hindered in what it can initiate by a United States veto.
Yeah.
Over veto action. And it won't be just the United States. Of course, it'll be the United States and Slovakia and Hungary and probably a handful of other nations which will look to the United States rather than to Brussels for guidance.
Yeah. So this is the point where John Mearsheimer argues that overall Russia has an interest in keeping the United States in Europe as the top dog of NATO because it's an offshore balancer. And even if the Europeans arm and so on, as long as that happens within a framework where at the end of the day, the top dog makes the decision and you have an agreement with the top dog, overall, you have a structure. You have a structure to work.
I will go further than that, this fits very nicely into a multipolar vision of security.
Yes.
Because we are talking about a transatlantic pole and a Eurasian pole. And then there will be an East Asian pole and others. But the Euro-Atlantic pole will be led by the United States, period. And everyone else currently in NATO will be forced to fall into line with that pole. Eurasian pole, again, perhaps tacitly, perhaps depending on the nature of the agreements and the discussions that ensue in whatever security treaty and doctrine is established after the Ukrainian war, perhaps even explicitly, Russia becomes the guarantor for peace in much of Eurasia. And certainly we've seen from the recent visits of the president of Kazakhstan, of the policy taken by Georgia and other nations, of course, Belarus, that this leadership role is recognized and valued. Because, if Russia's essential function remains that of maintaining order internationally in the region of the world in which it dominates, all the other major nodes of this multipolar order would be happy to let it do that, because assuming that burden by any of them individually would be impossible. Even the wildest dreams of neocons do not anticipate the United States actually intervening and governing and resolving conflicts throughout the world. It suffices to do that in its own, for it to do that in its own backyard, as its responsibility. But in order to have a free hand doing that, it has to give other polar regional hegemons the ability to do that in their own backyards, and then to come to an agreement among each other.
Do you, I know we are not, this is pure speculation, but do you believe that we will see how this now impacts Venezuela? I mean, the Trump seems to want to make the point that Venezuela is US backyard, and if that structure that you're talking about comes through, then at some point we would need to see the tacit agreement of the Russians to say, like, fine.
You're right. Everything is negotiable in politics. In the Großpolitik, great politics, everything is negotiable. Your mother is negotiable. Your allies are negotiable. And Russia can cause problems, and Russia can become popular, more popular, very easily, just through rhetoric and relatively minor assistance to Venezuela and defending it in international fora and things like that. It can cause a headache for the United States that the United States does not want or need in its in the region in which it is hegemon, which is the Caribbean, Central America, and it's trying to make sure that as much of Latin America as possible is in that camp as well. So it doesn't need difficulties with Russia. On the other hand, if Russia doesn't make difficulties, then maybe the United States can put a little extra pressure on Ukraine to get an agreement, and then we can all divide the world happily between ourselves.
Do you we still have this one organization around that's just lingering around and doing nothing, but that might I keep thinking it should at some point become obvious that it can serve a purpose again, and that's the OSCE. Do you think that part of this will that the OSCE might be revived in order to work on this infrastructure? Because I mean, if there's a peace agreement actually, and there is a return to normalcy within Europe, the OSCE would be unblocked as well and be a forum for Russian European kind of security structure.
The OSCE has developed bureaucratic institutions and permanent personnel that make it difficult to restructure, like the European Commission or like the United Nations. Anything it's become infested with a certain type of liberal bureaucratic globalism, for want of a better word, that I think make it difficult to salvage. However, the idea for the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the predecessor to the Organization,
the CSC,
came out of the Helsinki Accords, which were the Soviet effort to bring to an end the divisions of World War II and to ratify what had not yet been recognized by Germany, for example, which were the eastern borders, and to put all of that behind. There's an interesting phrase in the 28 points about the last 30, putting an end to the disagreements of the last 30 years, putting that all behind us. Now, if that is going to actually come to fruition, it will have to be, I think, under the auspices of a new Helsinki Accord.
Yes.
Maybe the new Budapest Accords, or who knows where it could be. But I could easily see a successor organization taking into account the problems that the OSCE ran into, succeeding, and for a while, nothing works perfectly. Nothing succeeds in the long run. Everything runs into problems like any machine. But the League of Nations was not the end. That failed, and the United Nations did a little bit better. Maybe it needs reform. Maybe it needs something else. It too is evolving. The OSCE was the first draft. Clearly, we need something that works better with a renewed affirmation of principles, which are new principles. Russia is going to not make, accords based, or let's say, state the principle of indivisible security as an afterthought 10 years later, as it did after the founding of the OSCE. It's going to make that a foundational principle of any new pan-European security organization.
Yeah.
And I think that would give it a greater prospect for success.
Yeah, and of course there's the point that the ties that Russia also has forged, and that it will probably be something more of a Eurasian security framework. So
exactly, it would be in a position to encourage, I think, the broadening of the membership of the current OSCE.
yeah, and extend it also to China, and then foundations, but with what the OSCE already has, with the baskets, with the principles, carry that forward and structure anew.
It's a big task that requires many years of negotiation.
Yeah, but the foundation is there. I mean, if this what is currently being worked on actually becomes a treaty, then that can be the foundation for building, especially if the G20 and the G8 are actually unblocked as well with Russia. Last thing, do you think that Russia will be readmitted to the G8? That's, to me, a bit of a stretch.
I don't know. I don't know. So the treaty, the proposal, 28 points, makes that offer.
Yeah.
Can that the invitation be denied or vetoed by another member? Is that how the process works? I don't know. As I understand it, it depends who the host is. So if the host says, I'm going to invite these guys, that's not only the G8, by the way. So there's the 8 official heads of delegation, and then there are always observers and groups that are around that, attend some of the meetings, but not all of the meetings, and are around to discuss and things like that. So I could see that eventually moving forward. But the question is, why would Russia want a meaningless organization to be a member of really a second-rate organization like the G8 these days? I mean, it has more than enough invitations of its own. And I think the groups that are the most interesting to it are not 8 pro-Western countries where it's going to be a lone wolf, but rather larger, more inclusive, and actually more effective Asian organizations in which it is already a member and beginning to reap the benefits.
Yeah. On the one hand, you do want to sit as many at as many tables as you can. On the other hand, the question is there potential secondary damage involved in that?
Yeah, I don't think Russia sees this as a big benefit to it. I mean, it's nice of you to offer, but I might prefer to dance with somebody else, actually.
Yeah. Okay. So this is one of the things that might leave the final version, but we will see. Nicolai,
there will be a lot of changes, I'm sure.
There will be.
But the overall framework, security, the financial assistance, and what was said about human rights and denazification is all in there, will probably, I think, be retained.
Yeah. I hope so. Nicolai, thank you very much for your time today. People who want to follow you, they should go to your homepage and read your articles there.
Yeah. npetro.net.
npetro.net. Nicolai Petro, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you. Bye.